Hello, my name is Gabby Richardson, and you are listening to The Nexus of Narratives, where we use stories to bring people together across belief systems. New episodes are released every Monday on your favorite podcast platform, where I have a conversation with a guest about an obstacle that they faced in their life that invited them to take a look at their own beliefs, whether about themselves or about the world around them. We talk about how those beliefs were formed and how formative moments shape how we interact with the world. The Nexus of Narratives is what we will uncover through this story exploration. It's the common thread that unites all of us, no matter what our beliefs are. And if you're an avid podcast listener, you know the deal. Please take a moment on the platform where you are listening to follow, rate, and review. Those little acts go a long way in ensuring that this important work reaches more people. Take a look at the show notes for information on this episode, how to connect with today's guest, and any content warnings. So if there's anything that you want to be aware of, that's the place to find it. So without any further delay, I look forward to sharing this story with you, and I'll see you again here on your feed next Monday or sooner on Patreon. Hello, I am Gabby. Thank you so much for joining the Nexus of Narratives. Dave, I'm so grateful to share space with you, so thank you.
Thank you for having me today. I'm looking forward to digging in.
Yeah, me too. It's a wonderful adventure to roll on. So if you were to briefly introduce yourself, I would love for you to share a little social location with us.
Yeah, great. My name is Dave Baldwin. I am originally from Pennsylvania, and I currently live in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina. So one of the things about my background, I noticed that there was a little bit of a cultural shift I had to make moving from the North to the South, and that I think the culture of the North, one of the things that I noticed is that people are tending to be a little more direct in communication versus there's a lot more people are a lot more tend to be polite in the South, not necessarily kind, but definitely polite. Those are two distinctive things. And so I remember just moving down here in the South in 2007. There's also Raleigh is part of the Bible Belt, and there's a lot more. I remember just being a little bit taken aback by how openly religious a lot of people were when I first came down here. But the interesting thing also is that between 2007 and 2025, the culture of this area has changed a lot, partly because a lot of people like me from the North have moved down here. And we often joke that the Mason-Dixon line has slowly migrated southward because of a bunch of us moving down here. We've also got halfbackers, people that moved to Florida and moved halfway back to North Carolina. And so it's been just really interesting watching the evolution of this area change. I remember having a sense of there was much more of the old South still alive when I originally came here versus now. I could go into a room of 20 people and it's possible that there's nobody originally from here in that room. So that's been a very gradual thing. It hasn't. So I think one of the things that I did notice is that I had some unconscious biases that I grew up with as a Northerner. We learned about the Civil War in school from a Northern perspective. They learned about the Civil War from a Southern perspective down here. I ran into a couple of people that told me they went to a school and they referred to it as the War of Northern Aggression. I'd never heard that before, but that's so there's a few. So there wasn't really anything huge or big difference, but it was enough. There was enough of the just subtle perception differences that it was enough for me to notice. And I also realized that I had an unconscious bias that if I heard somebody speaking with a Southern drawl, I started automatically talking more slowly and talking down because I perceived somebody from the South as being less intelligent or less sophisticated. And it took probably about 2 years of living in the South before it really came home. That I realized that there was a lot of people with deep Southern drawls that were very highly intelligent individuals. And I realized that was an unconscious bias that I didn't realize that I had until I had a lot of exposure to that. So that's, I'm sure I could say a lot more about it, but that's what initially came to mind when we first talked about social location.
Yeah, wow, that's really powerful actually, of like talking about beliefs that get rocked like right in the first minute, like bam.
Hmm.
Yeah, and yeah, that's really interesting because that's definitely a stereotype and a belief system that I think is something that's common for people to maybe be invited to take a look at some point in their lives or overcome, or maybe they don't. But that is certainly one that is very real, I think, in so many different areas of our country. So fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing that. And so we'll just dive straight into it. I know you already had a story or some stories in mind that you wanted to share. So I'll just let you have the floor for that.
Well, yeah. So the way I organize my life story, I think of it in segments. I mean, there's my childhood, which in many ways I had a pretty good childhood. I had a supportive family. I was never homeless. I was never poor. I never had to worry about not having a roof over my head. I went to a decent school, went to a public school, but I think it was one of the better public schools. I got a pretty good public education. And I think really the only area that I struggled with there's two areas. One was I had asthma as a child, and so I wasn't able to participate in physical activities and sports to the way that other kids did. And I'm tall. I'm 6'5". One of the things that when you're tall as a kid, your body grows faster than other kids. So I was always clumsy, and that may have played a role, and also the fact that I've always been more drawn to intellectual competitiveness and games that are mentally competitive. So growing up as a kid, I was a nerd. I was a computer nerd, and that there was good sides to that, but I did deal with some bullying growing up, and that was, I think comparatively not nearly as bad as what some kids dealt with. I still think I had a pretty easy childhood, but it did play a role. It was significant. And in my 20s, I started out as once I got into my first career after working at Wendy's in high school and flipping burgers and fries. Actually, that first job was one of the places where I learned a lot of the fundamental things about work that I still apply today. But after that, I went to tech school. Went to tech school for 14 months. Had a degree before I was, or actually, I'm sorry, I had a job lined up before I graduated, and I was for about 10 years doing computer programming, electronic control systems, and it was a good way to utilize my brain. But I also noticed that it was not good for my social skills to just be working around machines all the time. And in 2007, I decided to make a deliberate shift. I actually decided to start my own business for the first time. And there was a lot that went into that decision, which may be a separate conversation. But suffice to say, I didn't know how to start a business, didn't even really know what kind of business I wanted to start. I just knew that I wanted to be writing. That was something I'd always had a passion for. And I had fallen into the classic mistake. I don't know if you ever have run into Michael Gerber's E-Myth. It's a classic business book. A lot of people have read that, and the E-Myth, or the entrepreneurial myth that Gerber talks about, is the idea that if you're good at something, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be good at building a business doing that thing. But a lot of people believe otherwise, and I fell right into that trap. I thought, and I've got a lot of advice from people that said, "Oh, you're a great writer. You should be a professional writer and make a living doing that." And so I quit my job, and I didn't have a safety net. That was the same year I moved to Raleigh. So I left the town where I knew anybody. I came down here where I didn't know anyone. And I just went into business networking groups and had business cards printed and started telling everybody I was a professional writer. And it was really a struggle. I'll just tell you that the money did not come anywhere nearly as easily as I thought it was going to. And I just got a lot of blank stares and, well, good luck with that kind of responses. So over the next 10 years, it was let's just say a lot of fits and starts. There was some small projects I managed to scrape up, and that came interspersed with taking a variety of different part-time jobs and just taking whatever kind of work I could get to keep the bills paid. And I would have to say I learned a lot about living lean during that period, which was really valuable. I learned that I don't need a lot of money to live on, and I don't need to have a big lifestyle. I had left my previous tech job. I'd been making a lot more money, but I felt like a well-paid slave, and I also just wasn't happy. I mean, one of the things that had led me to make that shift in the first place was recognizing that I was in good health. I had plenty of money, But I was sitting here thinking, well, why am I still not happy? These things were supposed to make me happy, and they're not making me happy. And I just realized that there came a point where I came to recognize that I wasn't living the purpose that I was made for, and that I was never going to be satisfied with any life I lived if I wasn't living into that purpose. So after about 10 years of doing a variety of different writing and consulting jobs, I fell into an opportunity to work full-time at a bookkeeping firm, which I did for about 2.5 years. And I found that there was something I really liked about finance. There was something soothing and calming about accounting, because it really worked with the left side of my brain. I have a very logical and analytical brain, and something about numbers and things being black and white and being very well defined. I thought there's something about this that really works for me. And I had a really good experience with just a variety of different companies that I looked at, different sets of books. And I found that there was something about it that the more I learned about it, the more I liked it. And I decided in 2020, when COVID hit, we were about 6 months into COVID, and there was a lot of shifts happening. And I reached another point where I was beginning to feel that same dissatisfaction. And part of it was that bookkeeping itself wasn't really that challenging anymore once I learned a certain number of things about it. And I decided I wanted to go back out on my own, and because that's partly part of my life's purpose is to help people like me go out and write their ticket and make money on their own terms. And that's one of the inherent limitations of working for somebody else, is that you're always on somebody else's time clock. You're always on somebody else's terms. And I don't think it's totally possible to ever escape that, because I still have to pay the bills every month. I still have certain external realities that there's no getting away from. But one of the things about self-employment is that there is a greater degree of freedom and negotiability if you're willing to live with some of the discomfort of the financial uncertainty and the need to be always out there and connecting, networking, and looking for the next opportunity. And I recognize a lot of people don't want to do that, but I think a lot of times people may think that's a lot harder than it really is if they've never really tried to do it. And so part of my goal is to help really equip people with some of those practical tools. But one of the things that when we zoom back out and you look at the whole lifespan of my story and look at what was true the entire time, and part of what I thought we might dig into today, if it fits in the format, is the fact that I've always been looking for resources for self-development, personal development, and looking for what is that next thing that I don't know what it is to look for. So I've read a lot of books. I've taken different workshops and classes. I've hired coaches in search of finding the answer to that question. And I've found bits and pieces of the answer that I've put together over the years. And a lot of it has to do with being willing to accept that what I've come to believe might not necessarily be true, and becoming conscious of my, as I mentioned at the beginning, unconscious biases of all different kinds. And people talk about thinking positive, and I've realized part of the challenge with thinking positive is that 90% of my thoughts are unconscious. So it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to put positive thoughts in my head, but that's just the part I'm thinking about out loud. And it's the other 90% is where the real rubber meets the road, and that's where the real work is to be done. But the other thing that I recognized was from all the different self-development programs that I've read, all the different books on mental health, and all the different YouTube videos I've watched or articles that I've read, or all the different people I've spoken to, and everything that there is in the conversation about mental health and self-development, so much of it does not acknowledge the role of power dynamics. It basically, a lot of what you can read about mental health talks about individuals as if we each live in an island by ourselves. And the conversation about mental health, I believe, should not, it's overly individualistic the way we talk about it. It needs to be a collective conversation. And you can see simple evidence of that in the fact that you can take a mentally well person and put them into a community filled with mentally ill people. And over time, that effect is going to have an osmosis where, because if you're surrounded with people that have unhealthy thoughts and belief systems, you're going to take those on as your reality at some point, whether consciously or unconsciously, even if as an adult you will. And for a child, if that's the environment you grew up in, it's going to be that much harder to overcome. So I think part of what we all need to do if we want to be successful in life is we not only need to work on our mental health, but we need to be cognizant of the mental health of the environment that we're in. Sometimes that means getting out of an environment if you have the choice, which we don't always have the choice. But other times it means exhibiting leadership in very small ways. And a lot of times what I think a lot of people get tripped up on when you're trying to make any kind of change in your own life or in your environment is the tendency to try to make changes in leaps and bounds and try to make big radical changes, where I've been much more of a fan of the micro habit approach to making changes, to make one tiny little consistent change at a time and focus on what is the easiest thing to stick with consistently day in and day out, and to make less change all at once. Because I found that when I make big wholesale radical changes, those don't usually stick. I might be able to do it for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, but I found that it becomes harder and harder to maintain that change over time if I'm trying to do it artificially by force of sheer will. So I would say that by day and in terms of my professional life, I make a living and keep the lights on with bookkeeping and financial consulting. But my mission in life is really about equipping everyday people to find the tools to protect themselves against manipulation and gaslighting and adverse power dynamics. And financials definitely play a role in that. I think where the biggest tie between those two is that you need to learn how to not become financially dependent on somebody else, because that's where somebody really has a lot of power over you. And I'm an advocate of people deciding how their own life is going to go, and having that sovereignty that comes with learning how to move money. So that's Dave Baldwin in a nutshell. And I'll turn it back to you, and we can dive into any of that in more depth if you want, or we can go into something else. But that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I love it. I like the little, that's my story and I'm sticking to it, as if there was any alternative to it. There are several things that really stood out to me as you were sharing. One was, I heard my experience listening, hearing this sort of like a conflict between, this was way back as you were sharing, oh, but I did these things, I checked these boxes to do what I should do. I'm making money, I have the job, I'm doing the thing, I got the training. Why am I not fulfilled? And then really shifting yourself to align further with your purpose, as opposed to just checking those boxes. So one of the reasons why that really stood out to me is because I feel like there's some really strong beliefs about the way the world works, or maybe how you should appear in the world, or what your role is in life, that would shape the beliefs that you needed to do certain things to be happy, that then in that moment you faced and you were like, whoa, this is not the thing for me. So I'd love to dig further into that.
Yeah, well, I guess when you zoom out and look at my social location from a larger standpoint, I grew up in the West, I grew up in the developed world, and a lot of the ideas that I took in going back as early as I can remember in life is that our value is measured by how much money we make. And that was an idea that I just accepted without question for a certain point in my life until I learned how to question it. But I think also I grew up with the idea that, going to school, there was a very linear pathway that life is supposed to follow. You go to school, you go to college, you learn how to do something, that becomes your career, and then you get hired by a company to do that thing. And if you get better at that thing, you make money. And the better you get, the more money you make, and the more money you make, that means that's the more valuable you are as a person. And that was kind of the construction of unconscious beliefs that I came into adulthood with. And I think it's not that anybody ever explicitly told me those things, but that's just what I saw exemplified in the behavior of most adults that I encountered, not just my family, but everybody in the community and everybody in their communities. So I think that, yeah, but I think the real question is, what did it take what was the pattern interruption? And I think for me, it was just enough times coming up against the brick wall of feeling a lack of self-satisfaction. And when I went to the same kinds of people that I had learned to go to for advice, they couldn't give me any answers that were useful. And I think it was just, sometimes it was because I didn't really understand what question to even ask. I didn't really understand what was going on, didn't know what the problem was in any kind of language I could frame clearly. I just knew I wasn't happy and I didn't know why. And as far as I knew, I was following a lot of the pathways that I knew to follow. But if I were to really get honest about it, there was also some things I was doing that were not good. I was smoking. I was eating too much. I wasn't exercising, wasn't doing anything to pursue building a relationship. And so there was a number of ways where I could have told you, or I knew I wasn't doing a lot of the right things. But at the same time, I didn't have any motivation to do anything about any of those things. And again, I think I could explain the reasoning why now, looking back 20 years in hindsight, I can very clearly see what was going on. But if you'd asked myself of that time to explain why I was making the choices I was making, I would have given an incoherent and self-contradictory, and my response wouldn't really have made any sense because I didn't have any tools to make sense of it. But I think looking back on it now, part of what was missing was I had not learned psychological self-defense, and I hadn't learned how to guard my brain against ideas that other people would put in there, either just by happenstance, but by just the way that we just take in ideas, or sometimes there is deliberate manipulation. People want you to believe something because there's something they want to get you to do, whether it's advertising or a sales pitch, or somebody that's trying to manipulate you, where we run into manipulative behavior on a pretty continual basis in society. And that was not something I had learned to recognize or recognize the need to guard my mind against. And as an outgrowth of that, I had just a weak psychological immune system. And I just found myself just kind of floating around and going wherever the wind went and doing whatever I felt like doing in the moment, which was usually not what I needed to be doing. So that's I hope that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, it does. And also something else came to mind as you were sharing that. I really like how you said psychological immune system. Like, that's a really cool way to think of it, is like, how are we like protecting ourselves from the reality is the world isn't the kindest place. And that doesn't mean that we need to expect the worst out of people, but we do need to filter negativity in a way and find effective ways to do that. And as you were talking and thinking about some of the other pieces that you'd shared, this popped into my mind, and it may resonate or not, is like, I believe that like we as people are purpose-driven beings, and the trap is believing our purpose is what others say it is, which would be the like, oh, your purpose, human in America, is to make a lot of money for this big company, and then to have things that we call fancy, and then to have more of those things, and then to have those things, but as bigger things, and then to have those things, but as bigger things. And then what about more of those things? Don't you want more of those things? And like, that's the trap, is believing that that's the purpose, as opposed to truly discovering what our purpose as people are for us. Don't go anywhere just yet. We will be back with this conversation in just a moment. Thank you so much for spending your time with me here on the Nexus of Narratives. As you may know by now, it goes a long way to support the podcast by listening, following, rating, and reviewing. So if you have enjoyed the content, please take a moment to support extending the reach of this important work. While the public episodes of the Nexus of Narratives focus on the stories of our guests, how belief systems have been formed, and how to build connection, we keep the conversation going on Patreon. We've built a phenomenal community of peer connectors on Patreon who are looking to build a more compassionate world together. While I could be continuing the conversation with the guest or digesting fantastic themes with my dear friend Rowan, there is a lot of great bonus content on Patreon, including additional benefits for different tiers. Search Nexus of Narratives on Patreon or click the link in the show notes to join this exclusive community. I look forward to connecting with you there. For more information on the Nexus of Narratives, ways to listen, opportunities to connect with me, or share a story of your own, go to nexusofnarratives.org. I personally monitor that inbox, so it is a quick and simple way to connect directly with me. Whether you're a new listener or have been around for a while, I'm deeply grateful for your time and commitment to this work. Without keeping you any longer, let's get back to the story.
Yeah, no, and I think there's something that's a bit seductive about just following the path of competing with, who having the biggest house and the shiniest car and the most money, because it's such a linear and obvious path. It doesn't really require that much intellectual effort because the planning's already been done for us. I think there's something that about asking the question of what does a true fulfilling path look like when there is no roadmap for that. I think it is an understandably uncomfortable thing to think about, and I think that's why a lot of people would just rather not think about it. And I think I've learned to approach that problem from a standpoint of compassion rather than condescension, which is what I used to. I used to think that I think falling into a trap of self-righteousness is part of what creates a feeling of being stuck, because if I feel like I'm superior to somebody else because I've made better choices than they have, then I'm justified in continuing to make all the same choices that I've always been making. And I think you can fall into that trap whether you are pursuing a materialistic life or a spiritual life or any other kind of pathway. And so I think that's the question always has to be, how do you balance the need for humility, but also the need to stay grounded in the core of oneself? Because I think you can also fall into the trap of being too humble to the point where you lose your identity, and then that also becomes a way that a backdoor to manipulation. So I may have just kind of gone a little bit off track there. I just realized, but
no, it's okay.
Yeah.
This certainly isn't necessarily there's only one lane to the road and it's point A to B to C. Is certainly not how these conversations typically go. And it's fascinating because as you were speaking, it was reminding me of the previous conversation that I had. And it was all about how often, especially in like a career focused trajectory, it is a very like masculine energy of it's A, B, C, D, and it goes in this path, and this is how it goes, and this is how we do to then get what we want. It is like you do this thing, then you get it, and then you're finally being the person that you want to be. It's like a very funny kind of particular and unbalanced, as you were saying, like way to create our lives. Whereas this following purpose and this compassion that you were speaking about, and that side of humanity, it requires so much more flow and a lot less like of this analytical, do this, then that, like input, output, input, output, input, output. It's so much more complex and in a wonderful way. And part of my work and my growth of my own beliefs is like, I want it to be that simple. I want an input and an output. It's satisfying to get an input and an output that is clear and tangible. But I am just accepting the fact that that's not how everything works. That's actually not how this dance of life always works.
Yep.
There are some things that it does, but especially the further that I find myself leaning into my purpose, the less clear those immediate inputs and outputs are. It would be like, I'm putting out energy, I'm doing things, I'm being a certain way, I'm showing up for people in a certain way. And then it almost feels serendipitous how I'm like, oh, why are these things coming to me now? Oh, this is interesting. Where is this coming from? Like I do still believe there's a balance in an accounting system, but it's not so clear to us with the way that we like to have inputs and outputs.
Well, when you talk about masculine and feminine leadership styles, I actually think every organization needs to have both. And I think that's what happens when you have a hyper masculine environment. Everything is structured like the military, everything is rigid, everything has processes and rules, and the way that you've described that. And one of the first jobs I ever had was in a factory where it was, everything was square and gray. No thought had been given to any aesthetics and the design of the building. You could tell it was all guys that invented this place. But now, so I think that the ideal would be, so on the converse, I've worked on teams where it was all women running the show, and I found that the issue you run into in hyper feminine environments is that there's a lack of structure where things become too fluid, and what tends to happen is the team goes around in circles and doesn't make decisions and just keeps rediscussing things, because that's kind of how, like, when you have a hyper feminine environment. So the ideal environment where you've got roughly, maybe not exactly 50-50, but like as close to that as practically possible. You've got male managers and female managers. I think that would, like, that's, to me, that's how most levels of most companies should be designed. And then, I think you probably would have flatter organizations. You wouldn't have as many layers of my boss and their boss and their boss and their boss, but it would be more like, it would be not exactly by consensus, but I think the ideal decision-making structure, when you know that you've arrived at a good group decision, when there's a moment of shared resonance, where there's just a moment when the whole room goes quiet and everybody can feel it at the same time, and everybody's like, yes, that's it, that's the path we got to follow. And you can't get there by a fixed formula or implementing a policy or forcing things onto a timetable. There's a certain mix of different things that there's as much art as there is science to it. And one of the one book that I take strong exception to is Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. I think there's a lot of junk psychology in that book, which is, okay, fine. But there's some valid points to it. But I look at it as, and for those who haven't read the book, the basic premise is, they said men are supposed to be like Martians that go into caves and think by themselves and then emerge when they have an answer, versus women are like from Venus, in the sense that they think about through problems by talking about them in a community. And so part of the author makes the case that friction happens in marriages because a woman will come to a man and want to talk about a problem, and he'll immediately start presenting solutions, which is not what his wife actually wants. She just wants to think out loud about the problem. And I found that those are two different modes that the brain operates in. The way I look at it is, I might be, because both men and women do both of those same things, but it's just not been defined or consciously talked about as much. But I found that sometimes I have to ask myself, okay, am I at a mode where I know what my problem is, I know what the solution is, I just know I need to implement it? Or am I at a point where I'm not really sure what the problem is, I'm not really sure what pathway to a solution I want, and I just need to verbalize this and talk about it with somebody in the hopes of getting a little bit more clear about it. And I've even codified that to the point where I've realized that this is a better way to use AI learning tools. I've actually started experimenting within the last couple of weeks, going in and using both Claude and ChatGPT, and I've created a prompt in there where I'll say, here's a problem that I'm thinking about. I don't want you to give me a solution or an answer. I want you to instead ask me a series of questions, one at a time, until I tell you that I've asked enough questions, and then I'll tell you when I'm ready for you to give me a solution. And I found I'm still tweaking it. I'm still playing around with different ways to prompt the engines, but I think the general takeaway is there's two different ways of thinking. And for whatever reason, it seems like women are socialized more to think one way by default. Men are socialized another way, but we're both capable of both methods of thinking. And I think a lot of it is, for me, has come down to understanding what my natural style is, and knowing when it's time to lean into my natural style, and then knowing when it's time to be willing to push against my natural style, because my natural style is not what's needed in every situation every time. So I think a lot of it is just kind of knowing how do I need to show up in this room right now? Is this my time to get on the stage and talk? Is this my time to be a little bit more assertive and forceful and take center stage and guide this conversation? Or is this my time to sit back and listen and be quiet and let somebody else talk? Is this my time to maybe chime in a little bit and then go back to being quiet? And I think that's a moment to moment thing. And I think one area where men have fallen behind, and I've definitely started out behind on this, and I've tried to get maybe more cognizant of it, is using the intuitive faculty. For whatever reason, men are not taught, at least in my experience, I wasn't taught to use the intuition. I was taught to think by logical deduction and things I can hang my hat on. But there's a lot to be said by intuitive reasoning, because sometimes the right answer just comes out of left field, and it just appears in my head for a reason I don't really understand. But sometimes I got to just follow that and see where it goes. So there's I think a lot of this really ties into psychological self-defense, because a lot of people, if you haven't learned a lot of these different ways of thinking, and you're stuck in one rigid way of thinking based on how you were socialized growing up, that you're just not going to know how to interact in a lot of those different situations. So,
yeah. And also what comes up for me in that is, I do truly believe that like men and women both balance like masculine and feminine traits. I know I have been, and I can easily be a very masculine woman, because I have learned to do all of the things all of the time. One of my harshest moments of feedback from a coach was, "Gabby, you're a great human doing." And I was like, message received. Okay. And so I personally believe that as we as people learn how to balance those different energies, to have the space to flow and offer that intuition to come in and say, oh, there it is. Yeah, the idea can come from left field sometimes. And then there's also time and space to be like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And sometimes it is that clear and sometimes it isn't. And what I also heard as you were saying, as you were speaking in this, like how we're thinking about things when we're socialized to different things, is this openness that is necessary so that we can invite some of those other ideas and ways of thinking, so that we can have that mental resilience. It requires a certain amount of openness and flexibility to then be like, oh, wait, I know that that's not the way, because I have been open to these different ways, and I have learned how to develop my own beliefs and my own strengths and my own values around my own purpose, that is not the thing. This is the thing for me. So that's one of the things that I was hearing too.
Yeah. I think part of the other element here that it makes life tricky is just constantly remembering as often as possible that the thing for me and my worldview may be radically different than the worldview everyone else is operating from. And I will never really know what anyone's worldview is other than mine. I'm not sure if the term solipsism refers to the idea this idea that everybody, that the whole world outside of me is my imagination, and everybody exists purely for my amusement and benefit. And I think there's this theory that some people walk around operating that way, and I guess when you're 2 years old, that's just natural. You think that the world revolves around you. But I think that's really the difficult piece, is that when it comes to communication, I don't really ever know how anyone hears my communication. I don't really know how anyone perceives anything I'm saying. In some ways, I'm kind of always flying blind to a degree, and I can get feedback. I can get visual feedback. I can watch the look on your face right now and see how you respond to things that I'm saying. But at the same time, I don't really know what your subjective experience is or how you might interpret that. And so that's one of the things I'm finding that when I look back on the people that have successfully influenced me, a lot of it has not been because people lectured me about concepts, but it's been about storytelling. And when I hear stories, those are the ones that I remember. One of my favorite authors is Jem Collins, who speaks to something you brought up earlier about how we were taught that we were supposed to do these things. And in his example, he talks about how in a corporate context, there's being a great company versus being a good company, and good to great was that book. And one of the things he says that good is the enemy of great, and that what happens is you learn that you're good at something, and that's the thing you're supposed to do. But what you're good at might actually be standing in the way of becoming great at something. And so when I look at all of this in terms of how these different social dynamics play out, and I look at what is the difference for me to make in the world, it's there's just this constant temptation or this gravitational pull to just do what's familiar and what I've gotten used to doing in the past. And I could, like right now, I could just say, you know what, I want to just build a bookkeeping company, and that's all I want to do. I want to have 100 bookkeepers working for me, and I want to just keep doing that. But I look at that instead as the bookkeeping is what pays the bills. That's my bread and butter. But I've got some bigger things I want to do, and I think about how I have a finite number of years left. I've got a finite number of heartbeats left, and what am I most going to regret having not done if I don't do it before, when I'm laying on my deathbed? What would I have most regretted? And it was actually that conversation that led me to go down the path of asking myself, what does it look like to build practical tools for psychological self-defense? I don't currently have any way to make money doing that. So I'm in the process right now of just building out content and just fleshing out the basic ideas of what does that look like. But I think that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's what moves me forward. That's what makes me want to go out and do the things that I don't feel like doing. And I think we all have to find that for ourselves, is what would you be doing all day if you won the lottery and never had to make money again? Like what would be the thing that gets you out of bed? And I think a lot of people have a certain type of spiritual atrophy that sets in if you've gotten used to relying on money as your only motivator. Yet you get up and you go to work, and then the weekend comes and you just plop down on the couch and watch Netflix for 48 hours until it's time to do it all over again. And so I think part of my calling in life is to help people overcome that type of atrophy. And I think it's doable. I think I've got a long ways ahead, but I think we're getting there little by little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this tickles one of my passions around personal growth and success that is completely different from the context of the podcast. So I am actually resisting every single urge of mine to not geek out on different tools and resources with you that I could probably spend 7 hours talking about.
Of course. That'd be fun. Yeah. My throat might get sore by then, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could be a different conversation. We can take breaks, and it doesn't need to be when the recording is on too. But so because we're at about 40 minutes here, I want to segue us to the questions that I like to ask everybody who joins the Nexus of Narratives. Is first and foremost, for anyone who's listening who can relate to any of the stories that you have shared, how can your story create connection for people who have similar experiences and similar beliefs?
Well, maybe can you maybe clarify that question a little bit of how can I'm not sure exactly the context there.
Yeah. So I am curious of how your story can create connection for people, but specifically the type of people who have similar beliefs to you, maybe similar experiences, they can resonate.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I think the way I see my story creating connection is, first of all, recognize that what I said about collective mental health, I think part of what we always have to do is be looking for the next person, the next community. I think I start with connection in most of my approach to anything, because I think anybody who's feeling either any degree of dissatisfaction or stuckness in life, the next answer most likely begins with making a new connection. And it could also mean making a new connection with somebody you already know, connecting at a level that you've never connected before. And it might be one of those cocktail party acquaintances when you see them. Hey, how you doing? How about that weather? How's life? Just fine. That's the type of superficial conversation. It might be that somebody that you have that type of relationship with, making to form an actual deep, authentic connection with that person. I think, but I think that really how my story creates connection is it starts with connection itself. It starts with it's not a question of what do I need to do next. It's a question of who do I need to connect with next. So that's I think if there's one takeaway from my story, that's really what it all boils down to.
I think that's so beautifully put. Yeah, I love that. And for anyone who can relate to any place that you were in your story, what might you say to a past version of yourself?
So, so a past version of myself, one of the things that I would say if I were to go back and sit down with my 20-year-old self is I might say you already have a lot of the knowledge that you think you need and need to go looking for. I think I spent a lot of time reading books and taking classes and asking questions that I already knew the answers to because I was hoping to find an easier or faster answer. And so my general approach, the mentorship I would offer to myself if I would have listened, but I'm not really sure, that'd be a tall order because I already knew everything back then. But I would probably say if you're sitting here and you're not really sure what to do, like you can't motivate yourself to exercise, you can't motivate yourself to get out there and build a better life, sit down and write a one sentence question to say what is the one question if you could go to God and ask one question, but you only have one question, what would that be in one sentence or less? And then sit down and write out, what do you already know you need to do to get yourself the answer to that question? If you were to act on all of the knowledge you already have, if you were to do all of the things that you already know you could be doing to make your situation better, what would all of those things be? And just that exercise alone, I think can be very illuminating and enlightening, just to bring awareness to the fact that we really don't need to go out looking for new information, new answers most of the time. Most of the time it's just doing what we already know to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what do or did you need to feel most connected to the people around you?
I think in order to feel connected, this is a question I would have answered differently 20 years ago, 10 years ago, in the sense that, earlier on in my life, I would have answered in terms of what I need them to provide for me to feel connected to them. But unfortunately, I don't control other people. They're going to do whatever they do. They're going to be whatever way they are. So what I truly need in order to feel connected to other people is I need to be grounded in myself. I need to feel connected to myself. I need to provide for myself the acceptance, the validation, and all those things that I used to think I needed other people to provide to me. And so paradoxically, the less I need from anyone else, the easier it is for me to feel connected to someone else. I think you can probably get a sense of when somebody approaches you and they're clingy and they're needy, it kind of makes you want to just step back. Exactly. It's kind of cringy. So I think I find that if I walk into a conversation or a relationship or any kind of a potential partnership or a friendship or a job or whatever it is, if I'm not walking in there from a position of need, but I'm walking in there from a position of having my cup full and my needs fulfilled, and I'm looking for what there is to give, then it's much easier for me to form a connection because people are more interested in being connected with me. So that's how I look at that.
Incredible. Yeah, I love it. And last but certainly not least is if there's anyone listening that's like, wow, these two have completely lost all of their marbles, I don't agree with a single thing that they've said, is how can your story create connection for people who have different experiences and different beliefs?
Yeah, let's see. So, first of all, I'm a big believer that disagreement is where a lot of the best ideas come from. So it's actually one of the unfortunate things about the polarized political nature of our society is that there's a lot of groups where there's too much like-mindedness, and it creates thought bubbles. So if you disagree with me, great. I hope because I'm sure I'm wrong about at least half of everything I said today. So that's so the way that you can create. So I would say for somebody, let's just say if you disagree with what I said, I mean, obviously it depends on what somebody disagrees with in particular, but I would say you can definitely find connection through being willing to adopt a contrarian mindset and being willing to challenge, being willing to confront, being willing to question the things that you hear, and be willing to be the person that says, I don't agree with that when everybody else in the room is nodding their heads. So that's maybe a little bit of a different slant from what I said before, but does that answer your question? I'm not sure if I'm quite getting at where you're trying to go with this, but that's what came to mind.
That it's about what comes up for you. It's not about a right or wrong answer. Yeah. It's just about what comes up. It's, for me, asking these questions is part of finding this nexus of narratives. Is where are the intersections? What is that commonality, and what are people seeking, and where can we create more connection? So I won't tell you you're wrong, because it's your experience. Yeah. But so if there's anyone listening that would like to get in touch with you or stay connected, I know we'll have some information in the show notes for people, but how can folks find you?
You can find me on my website, dave-baldwin.com. Don't forget the hyphen. One of these days I'll get the domain without the hyphen, but it's dave-baldwin.com. And you can find me on X at the handle Real Dave Baldwin.
Awesome. Fantastic. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to geeking out with you on some personal growth and success tools.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wow. What a tremendous conversation that was. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you were able to find just as many nuggets of wisdom as well as actionable steps to build connections in the spaces all around you. This is an extremely grassroots production, so thank you to my dear friend Rowan for their commitment to this work by posting on social media and leading fantastic conversations with me on Patreon. So be sure to join that community on Patreon and enjoy the additional content. And thank you, of course, to my sweet and talented husband, DJ, for creating the music that is used in this podcast. Now, let's go out and create some connection in this world.